Welcome. Sales of nuclear shelters and radiation-blocking air filters are surging in Japan. They're concerned that we're going to have a war there. And of course, this is something that we did not foresee, and certainly the Japanese did not foresee. They say a small company that specializes in building nuclear shelters, generally under people's houses, has received 8 orders in the month of April alone, compared with 6 orders that they received during a typical year. So if you annualize that out, even though we're not finished with April yet, that would be a 1,500% increase. These things are not cheap either. The air purifier for 6 people sells for about $5,600. One that would be for 13 people, and the kind of shelter that they're talking about underneath a house would be about $15,500. And they say they can't even keep up with demand. They said it takes time and money to build a shelter, but all we hear these days is, I need one now. It just goes to show that you have to prepare in advance. Who would have thought when we voted for Donald Trump that one of his first priorities would be to attack North Korea, that we would become, again, the world's policeman in an area of the world where we first became the world's policeman, where we didn't get a declaration of war by President Truman. 64 years after the ceasefire, we see that China is using North Korea as leverage to get trade considerations out of the United States instead of the other way around. As I've pointed out before, it is China that has a massive concern about the immigration that can occur if there was a war, the massive number of refugees that could go into China as well as into Russia. That's why they have forward-placed a lot of military at the borders to keep that from happening. They've already had situations where there's been a massive release of North Korean prisoners, criminals, into their society. And of course, no society can handle uncontrolled immigration. China knows it. Russia knows it. Americans know it, except for the American left. And some people in France even understand that. We will see with the runoff election whether they truly understand that. But as we see these things heating up, we now see President Trump today went to the United Nations, I guess, to talk to them about war, perhaps to get approval from the Security Council. President Trump hosted members of the UN Security Council at the White House today. They say on CNBC, this is a highly unusual meeting. Yes, it is. Made even more startling because of the harsh criticism of the UN that we saw during Trump's campaign and the kind of criticism that he had since taking office. But of course, it's a great banner day for UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. She's at the top of the heap. This is her month to be president of the Security Council. And she's enjoying this along with the people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Elliot Abram, all these people, Paul Wolfowitz. They say Trump is looking great. He's looking great to the neocons. Yes, he is. And of course, again, we were talking just a few weeks ago about how Trump is going to reduce the UN's budget. But now it appears that we're going to maybe make some concessions to the UN as well as to China if the UN will allow us to spend more of our blood, more of our treasure in Korea in another war, presumably for the UN, because they keep saying in these establishment papers and Reuters, they say, well, this is in defiance of UN sanctions the North Koreans are, so the U.S. has to do something about it. So if they'll let us do something about it, then we will, I guess, pony up for the UN and give them more money. Meanwhile, sometime, not specific about when it'll actually happen, President Trump is going to meet with all the Senate, all 100 of the senators this week. He will brief them on the situation in North Korea, presumably after the military-industrial complex and the bankers and the globalists and the United Nations have decided, along with President Trump, what they're going to do about it. They will then inform the Senate, which I guess is an improvement. Panetta, when he was defense secretary, remember we had that back and forth between Senator Sessions, and Senator Sessions had, well, you would certainly go to the American Congress for a declaration of war. And he goes, no, we would talk to our allies, we would talk to the United Nations, and then we might tell Congress what's going on. And now that's exactly what we see happening. At the time, Senator Sessions could not believe his ears. Says, I can't believe this. You're a congressman, Mr. Panetta. You know what the Constitution says. Panetta was really pretty arrogant about it. But that's exactly what we see happening right now. They say this comes after Trump criticized North Korea's continuing belligerence in a phone call with China's President Xi, and also in a separate call with German Chancellor Angela Merkel today. So there we go. We're consulting with our foreign allies. We're begging the Chinese for permission. And then at some point, we may inform the Senate of what we're going to do, but we're not going to have a constitutional declaration of war, most likely. We'll just go into it. So we should ask ourselves, And look at the last action that we had, the dropping of the Moab bomb. Did that really accomplish anything? Trump maybe got a popularity boost out of it for now, but it may be a sugar fix. Anti-war points out that while U.S. officials have made a great deal about the quote-unquote message that was sent by the use of the massive ordnance air blast bomb, they also call it Moab, the mother of all bombs. We've heard that on and on and on, the echo chamber of the warmongering mass media. Well, did it really do anything? They say officially we were told first that there were 36 people that were killed, ISIS fighters. Then they said 96 ISIS fighters were reported killed, but then we never saw any evidence. We're not going to see any evidence. The Pentagon has insisted that they're not going to assess what the bomb did on the ground. Reuters reporters have actually visited the site, and they are coming up short on evidence. They say they can't see anything other than a scarred mountainside and a bunch of burnt trees. They found no obvious crater. They didn't find any bodies. But here's the most damning part of it. We were told that they had to use that giant bomb not to impress us because they got the biggest bomb, but because they had to take out the tunnels. Yet what's happening? We have Afghan soldiers in the area exploring the tunnel system beneath the site of the bombing, which was apparently still intact. You see, the Moab bomb isn't really set up to take out tunnels. There's an MOP, a bunker buster bomb, that has actually been used in the past for that, but this is the first time Moab was used. Moab has not been used before because what it does is it creates a 1 mile radius blast surface that is very difficult to control in terms of collateral damage, killing innocent civilians, for example. And it is not set up to go after the tunnels. That's the bunker buster bomb. And so they dropped this bomb, but yet we were told immediately. The Pentagon said it was the right bomb in the right time, in the right place. Well, maybe it wasn't, and maybe they knew that, which is why they came out with that pronouncement. So there's no evidence that's going on there. They're looking at the tunnel system, which still exists. And then meanwhile, we see that maybe they have rekindled this war that began under George W. Bush. Was it really mission accomplished? He didn't accomplish the mission. We're still there. We were there throughout all 8 years of the Obama administration. Now we're kindling this up to a much larger war. There was a Taliban attack on a North Afghanistan army base that killed at least 163 last week. There was a national day of mourning following Friday's attack on the army base. They say the death toll is continuing to rise, and so is the anger of the people in Afghanistan. They're calling for security officials to resign after yet another high-profile failure. So 163 people killed at an Afghanistan army base. Today, we had U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis arrive in Afghanistan. He is looking at whether or not they're going to increase our military presence there. And they had a suspected Taliban insurgent set off a car bomb at the U.S.-operated base in Afghanistan, according to officials. At least 4 people were reportedly killed, 6 others wounded. The attacker detonated the car bomb at the entrance to Camp Chapman, a secretive facility manned by U.S. forces and private military contractors. That's reported by RT. They say at least 4 security guards were killed, 6 others wounded in the attack in the eastern province of Khost. And this is as Mattis is looking at the situation, contemplating sending even more troops into Afghanistan, bringing up that war again. And as we've seen before, with the attacks on the Egyptian church on Palm Sunday, one of the most vulnerable areas that you have is at the entrance, where you are screening the cars or screening the people going into, let's say, the airport. And so setting up this kind of TSA security that we have in the airports doesn't help anyone's security. We've seen at the Egyptian church, now we see again at this U.S. military base, that when you mass people together, like we do at the airports, that's just going to increase the casualties of a suicide bomb attack. Now, in other news, we had over the weekend many people celebrating, or not celebrating, but commemorating the anniversary of the Armenian genocide. It's been 102 years since the Ottoman Turks tried to wipe out the Armenians. And of course, this coined the term, it was coined by Raphael Lemkin. He coined the term genocide, a deliberate, systematic attempt to eliminate an entire people or an entire race. And we have now seen that done over and over again. But this is the first time that it was done. This is the first time that it was at the Armenian genocide. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a statement on the 102nd anniversary. And they had in 2015, the Canadian House of Commons unanimously passed a motion declaring April the 24th, today, as Armenian Genocide Memorial Day. And yet, our American presidents cannot use the word genocide when referring to this situation. And that includes President Trump. He's continuing the tradition of former presidents, like former President Obama, who refused to call this mass killing a genocide. Today, he issued a statement about the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians. He declined to label it as a genocide. He said, "Today we remember and honor the memory of those who suffered during the Meds Yegrin, one of the worst mass atrocities of the 20th century," but he would not call it a genocide. And I think it's significant. When you cannot say the words radical Islamic terrorism, as Obama couldn't, there is something wrong. And of course, Donald Trump has said that many times and continues to say it. And yet McMaster's, who he put in as head of the National Security Council, one of the first things that he did was to tell everybody, we are not going to use that phrase. Words have meaning. If you stop calling people illegal aliens and you call them undocumented immigrants, that does a lot to change the terms of the debate. They're really foreign citizens who are criminally trespassing here, and but we can't call them that. We call them undocumented immigrants. And so to call this just the Meds Yegern, instead of calling it a genocide, is a weak statement at the very least. He said, "I joined the Armenian community in America and around the world in mourning the loss of innocent lives and the suffering endured by many." Trump's statement is an important gesture to Turkey. And that's the takeaway here, folks. The influence of Turkey, the rising influence of Turkey here in the United States. So we all know that Israel and Saudi Arabia have massive influence in the United States. Many people do not realize the massive influence of Turkey in the United States. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The Turkish government has resisted using the genocide label since the Ottoman Turks did it in 1915. Recently, more than 80 lawmakers sent a letter to President Trump pressing him to use the term, but he refused to do that. And so the Armenian Association said the president's statement fails to stand up for human rights and is inconsistent with American values. It represents the same kind of capitulation to Turkish authorities, which will cost more lives. They say there really should be an investigation into the surreptitious Turkish influence on the U.S. government. Asked why Trump decided not to use the term, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said the statement is consistent with statements that have been put out for at least the last several administrations. And unfortunately, his statements and his actions are also starting to look very much like the foreign policy of the last several administrations as well. And so there's a question. Doug Bandow asks the American Conservative. He says, is Turkey still a bridge to the West? And he points out that Turkey's president, Erdogan, put his power and prestige on the line this month to get more dictatorial powers. He pushed a constitutional referendum to create an all-powerful executive. He purged, he arrested tens of thousands of Turks. He cowed the opposition press. He made criticism a treasonable offense, and he manipulated electoral rules. He committed vote fraud, yet the measure still barely passed 51.4% to 48.6%. Now, he took power in 2002. Initially, he spent several years liberalizing the economy. Even liberal secularists and feminists backed him. Turkey prospered economically. The Turks enjoyed greater freedom. He wanted to become part of Europe. He was going to join NATO and the European Union. But there were always people who doubted him, says Doug Bandow. Erdogan once said, quote, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it until you arrive at your destination, and then you get off. We've seen that many times, haven't we? Around 2010, he changed directions radically. And instead of having a secular government, instead of having a liberal government, he started you saw a lot of corruption. Tax investigations became a tool of repression. Critics, even children, were prosecuted for insulting his majestic person on social media. And then, after spending a lot of time cooperating with Fethullah Gulen, an Islamic imam who has over 1,000 schools worldwide. As a matter of fact, here in the United States, the Gulenist movement gets $500 million with a B, taxpayer dollars in charter schools.